"You can wait outside." Those words weren't just polite, they were a barrier. A thin, almost invisible line drawn between what was mine and what they pretended belonged to them. Behind the glass doors of that grand ballroom, laughter swirled like smoke around chandeliers. Conversations buzzed with congratulations I had earned but was forbidden to hear. My name hovered on the projection screen. Defense Innovation Excellence Award. Every algorithm, every protocol, every safeguard that had stabilized Phoenix Technologies after the Falcon project disaster, my work. And yet, they had the audacity to pretend I didn't exist. I tightened my grip on the folder in my hands. 8 months of system specifications, automation protocols, and defense contract documentation. Work that had saved projects, secured contracts, and prevented catastrophes. Work that had never been acknowledged in boardrooms or speeches. Tonight, recognition was being stolen before my eyes, parceled out to those who had done nothing but manage optics. Diana Brooks, the operations director, glanced at me with that polite impatience reserved for obstacles she didn't care to understand. "We're at capacity for the ceremony," she said. A thin smile, but there was steel behind it. Everyone else from my department was inside, including the junior hire who barely knew the system I had designed from scratch. "I understood," I said, my voice low. My fingers moved across the keyboard. One line, one email. "Please check your email." Within moments, chimes rang from phones across the ballroom. A pause, murmurs. My work, my uncredited life's labor, was now a ghostly presence they couldn't ignore. I didn't wait for reactions. I walked away. I'm Brady Sullivan, 47 years old, senior systems engineer. I came to Phoenix Technologies straight from military service, trained to navigate chaos and extract order where others saw none. Precision, not politics, was my currency. I believed excellence spoke for itself. I was wrong. Credit doesn't appear. It is granted or denied. And those who deny it are powerful enough to shape careers, control narratives, and erase contributions with a single decision. But I had learned. Every file saved, every timestamp documented, every approval quietly archived. Tonight wasn't an accident. It was a revelation. And it was just the beginning. The first lesson in corporate reality is this. Sometimes the system will try to erase you, but what it doesn't know is how quietly a man can prepare while it thinks he is invisible. The hallway smelled of polished marble and ambition, a scent that concealed fear and calculation. I watched the awards ceremony from the sidelines, each laugh and handshake a silent dagger. Every executive who smiled at Heath Morrison, the rookie seated at the front, believed themselves in control. They had no idea the real power behind the system they were honoring wasn't seated in the ballroom. It was in my hands. Years of experience had taught me one fundamental truth about corporate life. Recognition is a currency you never control. Titles, applause, plaques, they are illusions. The people handing them out are not necessarily the best or the deserving. They are the ones who can manipulate perception, who can bend narratives, who can decide whose labor counts and whose disappears. And tonight they were rewriting history in real time. I remembered my first year at Phoenix Technologies. Straight from the military, I entered a system in chaos. Production lines faltered. Automation protocols failed. Everyone saw the chaos, but no one knew how to fix it. I did. And slowly, quietly, I stitched together a framework that made the impossible work. Machines moved in perfect sync, schedules optimized, errors vanished before anyone could notice them. I did not seek applause. I believed in results, but corporate structures do not reward results, they reward the appearance of them. Every breakthrough I delivered was repackaged. Every efficiency I created was credited to someone else. At first, I doubted myself. Was I misunderstanding, misreading the hierarchy? But over time, the pattern was undeniable. Leaders spoke of collaboration, of team achievement, while privately reshaping outcomes to suit personal narratives. The company rewarded optics over substance, smiles over integrity, and in doing so, created a brittle structure dependent on hidden work that no one outside a select few understood. I had become part of that hidden engine. Invisible, uncredited, indispensable. And in invisibility, I learned something most executives never grasp. Power is not in the spotlight. Power is in control over what others cannot replace, over the knowledge they cannot access, over the systems that run their world while they take the credit. That night, as I watched the ceremony unfold without me, I understood that the moment had arrived. The system they depended on, the very framework they were celebrating under someone else's name, would become the instrument of accountability. And for the first time, I smiled, because the game they thought they were playing was mine to define. And the first move had already been sent. I stepped into the dimly lit corridor outside the ballroom, the sound of music fading behind me, leaving only the echo of my own heartbeat. Every step felt deliberate, a measured cadence toward the moment I had prepared for without anyone suspecting. 8 months of quiet labor, every system specification, every automated protocol, every defensive safeguard meticulously archived, all waiting for the precise instant when they would be powerless to deny it. That instant was now. You must understand something about corporate ecosystems. They are fragile. They appear monumental, permanent, unshakable, but in reality they are cages built on perception. Remove the scaffolding of knowledge, cut the lines of understanding, and the whole facade collapses. Executives may think they control the world inside their glass towers, but they rarely see the unseen forces that sustain it. People like me, who maintain the invisible mechanisms, are the only true custodians of reality. My laptop was open on the table beside me. The screen glowed with the quiet authority of months of preparation. I drafted one line, clear, precise, unavoidable. Please check your email. Nothing more. No anger, no flourish. Just the delivery of facts that, once received, would ripple through the upper echelons of Phoenix Technologies like a storm they had neither anticipated nor could control. As I watched their phones light up with notifications, I knew the game had changed. The murmurs behind me were the first tremors. Confusion, curiosity, unease. They were seeing the tip of something far larger than their event planners or PR teams could comprehend. Their celebration was a theater, and I was turning the lights on, exposing everything that had been hidden behind polished speeches and applause. I had learned early in my career that revenge in the corporate world isn't about shouting or confrontation. It is about precision. It's about timing, about letting them believe they are safe while every essential system, every piece of critical knowledge, has a thread linking back to you. And then, when the moment is exact, you reveal it. I did not linger. I did not watch the chaos fully form. That was for later. Tonight, my role was to release the first signal, the email, the notice that nothing inside that ballroom and nothing in their assumed power was secure without acknowledgement of the truth. The knowledge they had ignored, the credit they had stolen, would no longer be invisible, and the lesson they were about to learn would be cold, calculated, and unforgettable. Because in the corridors of power, silence is complicity, and I had chosen to speak, quietly, lethally, decisively. The email went out, but the aftermath was invisible at first. That's the art of true corporate leverage. You strike without witnesses, yet the impact spreads like wildfire. Phones buzzed. Laptops chimed. Executives paused mid-sentence, mid-toast, mid-presentation. Confusion. A single, small act that no one outside the inner circle could immediately understand. But the unseen gears of Phoenix Technologies had begun grinding against themselves, and no one could stop them. Years of observation had taught me to anticipate patterns. I knew who would react first, who would stumble under pressure, and who would make a desperate attempt to regain control. This wasn't chaos, it was calculated exposure. Every document I'd preserved, every timestamp, every log, every approval chain, was now a mirror reflecting truth they could no longer deny. And truth, when revealed in the right way, wields more power than any executive title or corporate veneer. From the balcony of my apartment overlooking the city lights, I watched the first internal messages fly. Murmurs in Slack channels, carefully worded emails from managers seeking clarification, HR inquiries laced with anxiety. It was subtle at first, almost polite, but the tension was palpable. They didn't yet know the scope. They hadn't realized the depth. And that gave me a profound advantage. I remembered Lance Cooper, my former manager, whose advice still echoed. Leadership doesn't care who builds it, they care that it works. They had always believed efficiency alone could cement their authority, but efficiency without understanding is fragile. Leadership without comprehension is empty. I had become the unseen bridge between success and catastrophe, and suddenly the illusion of control began to falter. By the time they pieced together that the email was not just an outburst but a strategic release of evidence, the damage had already begun. I had stayed invisible for years, quietly documenting, quietly preparing, quietly building something no one could replicate. Tonight, that preparation became an unbreakable leverage point. They had celebrated my work as if it were theirs, but now the true architect of their system had reclaimed agency. I didn't need to enter the room. I didn't need to argue. I didn't need confrontation. Power in the corporate world rarely comes from titles or speeches. It comes from control over the essential, the irreplaceable, the parts of a system no one else understands. I had that power, and they were about to learn just how swiftly a single hand can collapse the illusions of authority. Because in every company there is always one truth. The people who make things work quietly unseen are far more dangerous than any executive in a glass tower. By the next morning, the ripple had become a wave. Executives convened hastily, their carefully rehearsed scripts dissolving under the pressure of unknown variables. Emails flew like arrows, urgent, terse, desperate. Every message I had sent, or strategically withheld, was a trigger. And the chaos wasn't random, it was inevitable. Once control over critical knowledge shifts, even the most confident leaders falter. I had spent years observing the subtle weaknesses in corporate hierarchies. I saw the reliance on appearances, the obsession with optics over substance, the fragile confidence built on incomplete understanding. Tonight, each flaw I had cataloged, each overconfidence I had logged, began unraveling. They didn't see it coming because they had never looked beneath the surface. They never questioned the invisible forces, the engineers, the analysts, the silent architects who truly held their systems together. The first errors came from procurement. Contracts were reviewed in panic, approvals questioned, and dependencies misunderstood. One misplaced email triggered a chain reaction in logistics, then compliance, then client communications. Each team scrambled, believing urgency equaled authority. But without understanding the architecture, every action only compounded the problem. I watched it all with clinical detachment. Every pause, every uncertainty, every sudden realization they were missing pieces they had taken for granted was a confirmation of what I had long known. Power in a corporation isn't in the title. It isn't in charisma. It isn't in the applause of a ballroom. It is in understanding what no one else sees and protecting that knowledge until the moment it is most potent. Meanwhile, the award ceremony itself became irrelevant. Names were being called, speeches given, applause echoing, but the real story was in the silence they hadn't noticed. The systems that enabled the company's success were now in flux, held by someone who understood the consequences of every line of code, every protocol, every dependency. The invisible hand that had guided Phoenix Technologies for years had shifted, and with it, the balance of power. I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate. That's amateur behavior. Real mastery is quiet, deliberate, precise. I was merely observing the inevitability of cause and effect. The people who thought they controlled everything were now reacting to circumstances they didn't understand. And that, in itself, is the most telling revelation about human nature in corporate environments. Those in power often assume authority where they have none. Tonight was only the beginning. The email, the documentation, the resignations. It was all a chessboard, and every move they made revealed more of their strategy or lack thereof. And I, for the first time in years, could operate without pretense, knowing I had the advantage no one else even imagined. By mid-morning, the tension had escalated into panic. Leaders who once commanded meetings with poise now stumbled over words, searching for solutions that didn't exist. They were not just unprepared, they were blind to the very foundations of their empire. And that blindness is intoxicating when you wield it correctly. There is a strange clarity in observing the unraveling of those who once dismissed you. I had anticipated their moves. The first reaction would be disbelief, followed by blame. They would assume the email was a mistake, a technical glitch, a rogue message sent in error. That window of denial is precious because it allows the patterns of control to manifest without interference. And as they fumbled to understand what had changed, I watched from a distance, noting every hesitation, every assumption, every fatal underestimation. Executives scrambled to reach out to teams, only to discover gaps in knowledge they never acknowledged. Contracts were misread. Systems were questioned. Approvals slowed to a crawl. Each misstep was predictable, yet exhilarating to witness, like watching a massive machine grind to a halt because the engineer holding the schematics simply stepped back. I didn't intervene. I didn't need to. My presence was felt only in the shadows of their uncertainty, a ghost of competence they had long ignored. I reflected on the nature of corporate obedience. People follow protocols blindly, assuming that authority equates to understanding. But authority is often just performance, a mask worn over incompetence. The true power lies in knowing what must happen and how, in mastering the architecture of operations that no one else comprehends. That power had been mine all along, quietly exercised, carefully guarded, now revealed in a single, deliberate act. The resignations, though discreetly sent, had a psychological effect that was immediate. Senior contributors disappeared from shared calendars, vanished from chain of command emails, leaving gaps that executives didn't know existed until they tried to manage them. Panic isn't just noise, it's paralysis. They could not admit they were vulnerable because doing so would reveal years of reliance on invisible labor, and that reluctance amplified the chaos, turning confusion into fear. I allowed myself a private satisfaction, a subtle acknowledgement of the inevitability I had engineered. This was not revenge born of rage, it was consequence. The company had built its narrative on appearances, on the illusion of control, and tonight, that illusion fractured under the weight of reality. The people in power would survive, perhaps, but their confidence, their sense of invincibility, was forever altered. And in that shift, I realized something critical. The true battlefield of corporate dominance is not in meetings, awards, or promotions. It is in knowledge, access, and timing, the things most executives underestimate until it's too late. By late morning, the fractures were undeniable. Each department operated in isolation, scrambling to compensate for the gaps I had silently highlighted. Operations stumbled over dependencies they assumed were permanent. Compliance teams questioned their own reports, discovering inconsistencies they could not explain. Client-facing managers tried to reassure partners, but the tremors of instability were already visible. Every miscalculation, every pause, every frantic decision traced back to knowledge only I possessed. It's remarkable how fragile organizational confidence becomes when reality contradicts perception. Executives who once exuded authority now telephone subordinates for clarification, their voices tight with tension, their questions revealing ignorance they had spent years concealing. The veneer of competence cracked, exposing the raw, unpolished mechanics of control that they had never bothered to understand. They believed leadership was synonymous with understanding, but they had relied on the unseen labor of those beneath them, the custodians of function they never respected. I thought back to the countless moments of being overlooked, presentations delivered without credit, emails ignored, frameworks absorbed into departmental reports with my authorship erased. That pattern had taught me patience, precision, and the value of discretion. I had been cultivating leverage quietly, observing weaknesses, storing knowledge, and preparing for the moment when the illusion of authority would no longer suffice. And now, that moment had arrived. The human element was the most revealing. Fear is contagious in professional environments. Senior managers began second-guessing themselves, hesitant to authorize decisions they previously executed with confidence. Teams followed instructions tentatively, aware that the structures they trusted were no longer guaranteed. Small errors multiplied because those who should have guided the system were paralyzed by uncertainty. And every misstep fed the narrative I had constructed, not with emotion but with deliberate foresight. Meanwhile, I remained unseen, my presence a ghostly influence over every unfolding event. There was no confrontation, no dramatic exposure. Just the quiet, undeniable truth that the company's stability depended on people who had been systematically ignored and underappreciated. And as they scrambled to regain composure, I observed, cataloged, and allowed the consequences to propagate. This is the reality few understand. Corporate power is an illusion if divorced from expertise. Titles, awards, speeches, they are tools of control, but only knowledge and timing dictate real outcomes. By understanding both the human and structural fragility of the system, I had become untouchable. The leaders above me could react, resist, even protest, but their options were constrained by their own ignorance. And that is a privilege few ever grasp until it is too late. Tonight, the first wave of panic would subside, but the seeds of doubt had been sown. And once planted, doubt grows faster than any executive can contain. By early afternoon, the first external ripples began to appear. Clients called, curious, confused, some frustrated. Deliverables that had been seamless for years suddenly required explanation. Minor delays, overlooked communications, small inconsistencies, enough to provoke questions without signaling catastrophe. Executives scrambled to respond, their panic now visible beyond internal emails. This was the moment the illusion of invulnerability collided with reality. I had anticipated this. External perception is always the pressure point in corporate control. Internally, mistakes can be smoothed over, covered up, or rationalized. But when clients begin to notice, the narrative shifts. Trust becomes tangible leverage, and suddenly the leaders who assumed authority find themselves negotiating with reality on its terms. They had built their careers on appearances. Now appearances were fragile, and I held the underlying mechanisms intact, yet deliberately outside their control. Every client inquiry was an opportunity, but not for revenge in the traditional sense. I wasn't motivated by malice. I was exercising precision. My private framework, carefully maintained, was untouchable. Without understanding its architecture, no executive could correct course quickly. Every conversation I observed, every misstep I cataloged, amplified the understanding I had long cultivated. Power in organizations is proportional to control over essential knowledge. Without it, the loudest voices have the weakest grip. I watched Phoenix Technologies' leadership attempt to stabilize the situation. Apologies, reassurances, emergency meetings. Every move exposed gaps in understanding. Every reassessment revealed dependency on invisible labor. Panic spread like a contagion, but methodical. Not every department reacted simultaneously. Not every manager faltered at the same moment. It was an intricate cascade, and each stumble added weight to the overall collapse of confidence. Meanwhile, I remained strategically invisible. I didn't need to intervene. I didn't send another email. I didn't make calls. My influence was embedded in the system itself. They had unknowingly become reliant on my foresight they had ignored for years. The irony was deliciously absolute. The very people who sought to deny recognition and control were now constrained by the very work they had dismissed. And in observing this, I recognized a deeper truth about corporate life. Companies survive not because of titles, meetings, or polished speeches. They survive because of people who understand the machinery behind the scenes. Remove the understanding, and everything else becomes theatrical. Tonight, the whispers would grow louder, the leader's confidence thinner, and the perception of competence more fragile. Every stakeholder now sensed that something had changed. The game had shifted, and those who thought they controlled the boardroom had already lost control of the reality beneath it. By mid-afternoon, internal communications began to fracture. Emails that once flowed predictably now tangled into threads of confusion. Department heads questioned one another, passing blame for delays they could neither trace nor explain. Operational silos, previously a quiet inconvenience, became barriers. Teams that relied on my frameworks attempted improvisation and failed spectacularly. Every misstep reinforced the invisible dependency they had ignored for years. I observed with a meticulous detachment, noting which leaders tried to assert authority and which froze. Authority without understanding is fragile. A CEO can command a room, a VP can issue orders, but when the mechanisms behind those commands are misunderstood, power collapses under its own weight. This is the reality few ever admit. Systems, protocols, and processes are the true scaffolding of influence. Without them, rhetoric becomes empty. The subtle chaos spread outward. A minor scheduling error escalated into missed deadlines. Production bottlenecks emerged. Compliance flagged discrepancies that could no longer be traced back to their root causes. And in every instance, executives assumed control, assuming their decisions would correct course. But the truth was simple. Without intimate knowledge of the underlying architecture, every intervention only deepened the instability. I began to recognize patterns in their reactions, predictable, human, unavoidable. Pride prevented them from asking for help they had previously denied. Panic made them double down on familiar strategies that no longer worked. Miscommunication flourished because no one could interpret the system's signals correctly. Each moment of hesitation, each error in judgment, was both evidence of their dependence and proof of my foresight. Meanwhile, the employees who had quietly maintained the systems, the ones whose work was the backbone of success, were either overextended or silently disengaged. They knew the game, had seen the ceiling, and understood their limits. I had built my influence to operate precisely in that interstitial space, unnoticed, essential, untouchable. The disconnect between leadership and actual operational knowledge was now irreparable, and the results were manifesting in real time. The lesson is brutal and undeniable. Leadership without competence, without deep understanding, is illusion. Titles do not equal control. Recognition does not equal influence. And reward is irrelevant if the system itself fails. Corporations depend on silent expertise, and the moment that expertise is leveraged or withdrawn, the entire structure quivers. By the end of the afternoon, confidence across the executive suite had eroded. They were no longer strategizing, they were reacting. Desperation became the dominant emotion, and in desperation, mistakes accelerate. And I watched, silent, precise, invisible, knowing the moment of reckoning was approaching.